Hey there, and welcome back. Today we're going to take a deep dive into something that's impacting all of us, whether we realize it or not. Global supply chains.
Yeah.
Specifically, how they're being totally reshaped in this new multipolar world.
hmm
Now, you might be thinking, multipolar what? Sounds complicated. But stick with me because this affects everything.
Yeah.
From the price of your morning coffee to, well, pretty much everything you buy,
Right.
even the job market.
It really does. Yeah.
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got a stack of research and analysis from Morgan Stanley.
Yeah.
One of their biggest takeaways: supply chain strain isn't going away anytime soon.
That's right. We've all seen those headlines about shortages and delays,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easy to think it's just a temporary thing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not. This is a fundamental shift,
Mm.
and understanding it is absolutely key to navigating the future, honestly.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with those supply chain strains. Morgan Stanley actually found that production itself hasn't moved as much as we might think.
Yeah. There's been a lot of buzz about companies bringing production back home or closer to their customers, what we call reshoring and nearshoring. But it's trickier than it sounds, especially for complex products.
So it's more complicated than just packing up and moving a factory across the world.
Exactly. And even with all this talk of diversifying, China is still a manufacturing powerhouse.
Right.
Later on, we'll look at some charts that really bring this home. But first, let's talk about what governments are doing to encourage companies to shift production.
Okay, so governments are getting involved.
Absolutely. Morgan Stanley talks about the carrot and the stick approach.
Okay.
The carrot is all about incentives. Think tax breaks or subsidies to make producing domestically more appealing.
Yeah.
A perfect example is the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and the CHESH-PS Act.
So it's like dangling a tasty carrot to lure companies back.
Precisely. Then there's the stick, which is all about making it harder or more expensive to do business in certain places. Tariffs on goods from China are a prime example.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this push and pull is playing out. But you mentioned earlier that actually moving production is harder than it sounds. Why is that?
Think about the complexity of the products we use every day, especially electronics.
Yeah.
Those intricate components often come from very specific places. Take electronic integrated circuits, for example. They're essential for pretty much everything electronic, but their production is heavily concentrated in just a handful of locations.
So moving that production means not just building a new factory, but recreating a whole network of suppliers and specialized skills.
Right.
That's got to be expensive and risky.
Exactly. Imagine trying to transplant a delicate ecosystem to a completely new environment. It's not just about the physical move, but about recreating the conditions that allow that ecosystem to thrive. And that's where the J-curve effect comes in.
Okay, the what now? J-curve.
Imagine you're trying to make more things domestically, say here in the U.S. To build those new factories and get them up and running, you actually need to import specialized equipment and materials first. That initial surge in imports, before the benefits of domestic production kick in, creates a dip in the economic curve, forming a J-shape.
Okay.
It's a short-term cost for a potential long-term gain.
That's super interesting. It's like taking a step back before you can leap forward.
Exactly. And this is where China's enduring dominance comes into play. It's not just that they have the factories and workers. They've built a whole ecosystem over decades.
Okay, so let's talk about China. You mentioned some eye-opening charts. What can you tell us?
Take a look at Exhibit 3 from the Morgan Stanley report. This chart shows China's export rankings for different types of products. You'll notice they're the top exporter for most manufactured goods, even a lot of the really complex ones.
Wow, that's pretty striking. It seems like, despite all the talk about diversifying, China is still a major player.
It really raises the question, what does this mean for companies trying to move away from China? How much can they realistically shift, given China's deeply entrenched role in manufacturing?
Yeah, if so much production is still happening in China, how much are these reshoring efforts really changing things? I'm curious about what's happening with places like Mexico, since they're right next door to the U.S.
Mexico is a prime example of nearshoring. Companies are absolutely moving production there to be closer to the U.S. market. But even there, the success stories are mixed. They've done well attracting electrical machinery production, but IT hardware, not so much.
So why the difference? Is it the complexity issue again?
Exactly. IT hardware requires a completely different level of sophistication and investment.
Mm.
Think highly skilled labor, reliable infrastructure, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
Mexico's getting there, but it's a process.
So even with nearshoring, you can't just pick up and move any type of factory anywhere.
Right.
There are different factors at play depending on what you're actually making.
Yeah,
But what about the U.S. itself? Can't we just make more stuff here?
that's where it gets tricky. Morgan Stanley's report shows some sobering stats about the decline of U.S. manufacturing. Just look at Exhibits 37 and 38. They paint a clear picture. The U.S. simply doesn't have the same manufacturing capacity it used to.
So even if companies wanted to move production back to the U.S., we might not have the factories or the skilled workers ready to go.
Exactly. Remember that J-curve effect we talked about? Rebuilding that manufacturing capacity might actually lead to more imports in the short term. It's a bit of a paradox.
So it's a long game trying to rebuild that manufacturing base?
Absolutely. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of this multipolar world. Morgan Stanley introduces a helpful framework to understand how companies are being impacted.
Okay.
They call them enablers and defenders.
Okay, remind me what those are again?
Think of enablers as the companies that are actually benefiting from all this disruption.
Mm.
They're the ones helping companies navigate this new world of complex supply chains. Logistics companies, for example, or those that help set up production in new places.
So they're kind of like the guides in this new landscape.
Exactly. And then there are the defenders. These are the companies that are relatively shielded from the negative impacts of all the supply chain strain. They might have strong regional supply chains, or they produce goods that are less affected by these global shifts.
Got it. So you've got the companies riding the wave of change and then the ones who are weathering the storm. Pretty fascinating stuff. But what does it all mean for, the average person? How does this actually affect us day to day?
That's where the macroeconomic ripple effects come in. Think
Mm.
about it. When supply chains get disrupted, whether it's because of tariffs or shifting production, that can lead to higher prices for consumers.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. This is where it hits our wallets.
Indeed. And it's not just about price increases. These disruptions can lead to reduced consumption as products become scarcer or just too expensive.
So less choice and higher prices. Got it. Does the Morgan Stanley report give any real-world examples of this happening?
They do. They looked at the impact of the 2016 to 2018 U.S. tariffs on household appliances. Exhibits 43 to 46 show exactly how this played out.
Okay.
You can see prices for things like wash machines spiked, and that actually led to people buying fewer appliances.
That makes sense. And what about the big picture? How does all of this affect the global economy?
That's where the speed and scale of these shifts really matter.
Okay.
Rapid dramatic changes, kind of like a tsunami, can have much bigger effects on global growth and inflation compared to more gradual shifts.
So it's not just about what's changing, but how fast it's changing.
Exactly. And this brings us to a key point. The way these supply chains are reshaped and the pace at which it happens will have massive implications for the entire global economy and, by extension, everyone on the planet. It's not just about corporations and governments, it's about all of us.
Okay, so this isn't just about economics. It's about geopolitics, technology, even consumer behavior. It's about how we live in the world. We've covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
We have. And speaking of scratching the surface, Morgan Stanley ends their report with a thought-provoking question. We've talked a lot about China, Mexico, the U.S., but what about Europe? How is the most geographically diverse equity market in the world navigating these challenges?
Europe, that's a great point. They're a huge part of the global economy, but we haven't really touched on them yet. What unique opportunities and risks do European companies face in this new world?
That's something to consider as we continue our deep dive. And trust me, there are many more fascinating insights from the Morgan Stanley research to unpack. Let's shift gears for a moment and zoom in on a specific case study Morgan Stanley highlights. Electrical transformers in Europe. Might be thinking, transformers. A bit niche, isn't it? But it actually illustrates these global shifts perfectly.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes electrical transformers so important in the grand scheme of supply chains?
Well, think about it. Transformers are essential for power grids. They regulate voltage and ensure electricity is distributed efficiently. You can't have a modern society without them.
Okay, so pretty important then. But why focus on Europe specifically?
Because European and Asian companies dominate transformer production, and this case study shows how those European producers have been dealing with competition from, you guessed it, China.
Ah, so it ties back to that geopolitical distance we talked about
Yeah.
and how tricky it can be to diversify away from those dominant players.
Exactly. European companies have had some tough decisions to make about where to invest and how to allocate their production capacity. It's a real balancing act.
So what have they done? Have they just thrown in the towel?
Not at all. Companies like Schneider and Siemens Energy have actually made strategic investments in the Americas, especially North America.
Interesting. So instead of trying to go head-to-head with Asian manufacturers in their backyard, they've focused on building up capacity in regions closer to their target markets, kind of like a strategic sidestep.
Precisely. And it hasn't always been the cheapest option, but it seems to be paying off, especially with the rise of protectionist policies and the desire to de-risk supply chains.
So even if it means spending more upfront, European companies are gaining ground in places like the US. It's like playing the long game, right?
Exactly. And this case study has some important takeaways for us. First, shifting supply chains for complex products like these transformers takes serious planning and a lot of investment.
It's not a quick fix, as we talked about earlier.
Second, there's always an element of risk involved. You're essentially betting on future demand, potential policy changes, and your ability to compete in a new market.
It's like making a calculated bet on where the world is headed.
Exactly. And third, even with these efforts to diversify, it's unlikely that imports will completely disappear. You'll still have a global web of interconnectedness.
So it's more about finding that sweet spot between reliance and diversification, not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. Now let's shift gears from Europe and head back over to Mexico. Remember we talked about them being a prime nearshoring location? Well, Morgan Stanley did a deep dive comparing two sectors in Mexico, electrical machinery and IT hardware.
Oh, this should be good. We touched on Mexico earlier, but I'm ready for the full story. What did they find?
The results are pretty revealing. Electrical machinery has been a nearshoring success story. Trade between Mexico and the U.S. in this sector has absolutely boomed.
So score one for nearshoring, at least in this case, but what about IT hardware?
That's where things get interesting. Despite the potential, IT hardware hasn't seen the same level of nearshoring success as electrical machinery.
Is it the complexity factor rearing its head again?
You got it.
Yeah.
IT hardware requires intricate manufacturing processes and a very skilled workforce. Mexico's making progress, but they're still playing catch-up in some areas.
So it's not just about having factories and workers, it's about having the right kind of workers and the right kind of infrastructure to support these complex industries.
Exactly. And there's another fascinating insight that came out of Morgan Stanley's 2022 AlphaWise survey. They found a significant difference in how companies view investing in electronics versus IT hardware in Mexico.
Okay, I'm all ears. What was the difference?
There was a lot of enthusiasm for investing in electronics manufacturing in Mexico. Companies were eager to jump in.
But for IT hardware?
There was a lot more hesitation. Some companies were open to it, but others were resistant to investing in IT hardware production in Mexico, despite the potential benefits of nearshoring.
So even with all the talk about moving production closer to home, when it comes to the more complex stuff, companies are still hesitant. What's holding them back?
It goes back to that ecosystem idea. To really succeed in these complex sectors, you need more than just cheap labor. You need a network of skilled engineers, reliable component suppliers, and a supportive infrastructure. It's a big commitment.
So nearshoring is a powerful tool, but it's not a magic wand you can wave and instantly solve all your supply chain problems.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this ties into another interesting point Morgan Stanley raises about Mexico, the China buffer versus China bridge concept.
Okay, that sounds pretty intriguing. Break that down for me.
It boils down to this. Is Mexico helping to reduce reliance on China, acting as a buffer, or is it actually facilitating more Chinese trade, acting as a bridge?
So is it helping companies move away from China, or is it just another way for Chinese goods to enter the U.S. market?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, as with most things in the global supply chain world, is nuanced and depends on a specific sector.
Of course it does. Hit me with the specifics.
Let's take the automotive industry in Mexico as an example. Morgan Stanley's analysis suggests that Mexican-made cars actually have very little Chinese content, maybe only 2–5%.
So in that case, Mexico is genuinely acting as a buffer, reducing the need to import cars directly from China.
Yeah, exactly. But when you look at electronics exports from Mexico, the picture changes. Since 2019, Mexican electronics exports to the U.S. have skyrocketed by 34%, which is about $20 billion US.
Wow, that's huge. So Mexico is becoming a major player in the electronics export game. But if it's reducing reliance on China, shouldn't U.S. imports from China have gone down?
That's the thing. At the same time that Mexican electronics exports to the U.S. have been booming, U.S. imports from China in the same category have actually dropped by $33 billion, a 27% decrease.
So on the surface, it looks like Mexico is filling the gap, but something doesn't quite add up.
You're catching on. Here's the catch. During the same period, Mexican imports from China actually increased by about $9.6 billion, a 33% jump.
Wait, so Mexico is importing more electronics from China while also exporting more to the U.S. That sounds like they're just acting as a middleman.
Exactly. And this suggests that at least some of those Mexican electronics exports to the U.S. actually contain Chinese components.
So it's the China bridge in action. Mexico is facilitating the flow of Chinese goods into the U.S., just in a more roundabout way. This global trade stuff is seriously complicated.
It really is. It's not always clear who's winning and who's losing. These shifts in supply chains create winners and losers, and the lines are often blurred.
The China buffer versus China bridge concept is a perfect example of that. It shows how one country can play multiple roles in this global dance, sometimes substituting for China and sometimes acting as their partner. It's fascinating and kind of mind-boggling at the same time.
It is. And it underscores the importance of looking beyond the surface and understanding the nuances of these global relationships. Now, let's zoom out a bit and explore how different regions are being impacted by all of this. Let's start with North America. What's the situation there?
Okay, North America, home turf. What are we seeing here?
Morgan Stanley paints an interesting picture of the North American landscape. They found that U.S. companies are very aware of the risks associated with supply chain disruptions and those potential tariffs we talked about earlier.
So they're not just ignoring the problem.
Not at all. They're actively thinking about how to make their supply chains more resilient and how to mitigate those risks.
But are they focused on nearshoring, maybe working more closely with Mexico and Canada?
That's the interesting part. Their main focus seems to be on China rather than their North American neighbors.
That makes sense considering how much influence China still has in so many industries. But what exactly are U.S. companies worried about when it comes to China?
They're mainly concerned about those trade tensions escalating and how that could impact their business. They're trying to stay ahead of the curve and prepare for potential disruptions.
So it's a lot about risk management. They're playing it safe. But if they are interested in nearshoring, why are they doing it? Is it just about finding cheaper labor?
That's a great question. It seems like for U.S. companies, nearshoring is less about finding the absolute cheapest labor and more about building resilience and managing risk. They're willing to pay a premium for stability and predictability, especially when it comes to essential goods.
So it's about peace of mind. They're looking for reliable partners they can trust. Makes sense. Now, are there any specific industries in North America that are really laser focused on all this supply chain stuff?
Morgan Stanley points to three key areas: industrials, retail brands, and tech hardware. Each sector has its own unique set of challenges and opportunities.
Okay, let's break it down, starting with industrials. What are the key takeaways there?
Morgan Stanley's U.S. industrials analyst, Chris Snyder, actually believes that companies in this sector are in a good position to benefit from this current environment, even with the possibility of more tariffs.
Wait, really? Even with those tariffs, how is that possible?
Snyder argues that these companies have some pricing power. They can pass on some of those increased costs to their customers without hurting their profits too much.
Ah, so they have a bit of wiggle room. But what about the long-term impact of those tariffs?
That's where it gets interesting. Snyder thinks those tariffs, while painful in the short term, could actually make the U.S. a more attractive place for manufacturing in the long run.
So it could actually lead to more production happening here in the U.S. How does that work?
Well, as tariffs reshape those global supply chains, companies might start to see the benefits of making things closer to their customers here in the U.S. Snyder sees this as a potential driver of growth for U.S. industrial companies.
Interesting. So a bit of short-term pain for potential long-term gain. Now, which companies are leading the pack in this industrial landscape?
Snyder highlights companies like Trane Technologies, Vertiv Holdings, Johnson Controls, Eaton Corp., and Applied Industrial Technologies as being well-positioned for this shift.
And on the flip side, are there companies that might be more vulnerable in this environment?
Snyder points to those with short-cycle exposure as potentially facing more downside risk.
Okay, let's switch gears to retail brands. What's happening in that world?
Morgan Stanley's Softlines retail and brands analyst Alex Stratton has been studying the impact of tariffs on this industry, especially when it comes to apparel.
So how are apparel companies dealing with those tariffs, especially on goods coming from China? I know those were a big deal a few years ago.
It's important to remember Those Trump-era China apparel tariffs are actually still in effect under the Biden administration.
Really? So they haven't gone away?
Nope. And they've definitely had an impact. The average tariff on Chinese apparel imports is sitting around 15% right now.
That's a big chunk of change. No wonder companies are looking for alternatives.
Exactly. Now, back during the trade war, a lot of apparel companies were able to soften the blow of those tariffs by getting creative.
So what did they do?
They started sourcing goods from other countries, they negotiated better deals with their suppliers, and they even adjusted their pricing strategies.
So they adapted and found ways to survive.
Exactly. And a lot of them have also been proactively reducing their reliance on China as a sourcing destination ever since that last trade war.
Smart move. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, especially when those baskets are getting more and more expensive. But what about new tariffs? Are those on the horizon?
Morgan Stanley's public policy team believes that if new tariffs on China are implemented, they'll probably happen pretty quickly.
So, no time to waste. But what will those tariffs look like? Any predictions?
It's still a bit of a guessing game, but there are a few possibilities. On the one hand, tariffs could be targeted towards specific products or sectors, which might mean apparel gets spared altogether.
That would be a big relief for those companies.
On the other hand, you could have a blanket tariff of up to 60% on a wide range of Chinese imports. That would be a much bigger problem.
Okay, so there's a lot of uncertainty for apparel companies right now. It's a wait-and-see game.
Exactly. But they've been through this before, so they have some experience to draw on.
All right, let's move on to our final sector. Tech hardware. What's the outlook there?
Tech hardware is interesting because it's such a globalized industry. Components come from all over the world, and a lot of the assembly happens in China.
Yeah, it's a complex web of suppliers and manufacturers, which makes it particularly vulnerable to these supply chain disruptions and trade tensions, right?
Exactly. And Morgan Stanley's U.S. IT hardware analyst, Eric Woodring, paints a slightly cautious picture. He acknowledges that companies have been working hard to diversify their supply chains, but the reality is that most hardware production still takes place in China.
So despite those efforts, China remains a critical hub for tech hardware.
It does. And that means U.S. IT hardware companies could face some headwinds from new tariffs on Chinese imports.
How much of a hit are we talking about here?
Woodring estimates that a 10% tariff on Chinese imports could translate into a roughly 2.5% hit to earnings per share on average for the companies he covers.
Okay, that's not insignificant.
No, it's not. And some companies are even more exposed than that. For example, PC OEMs are seen as being 2-3 times more vulnerable than the average company.
Ouch, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah.
Any specific companies we should be watching?
Woodring specifically flags companies like Xerox, Sonos, Garmin, Cricut, GoPro, Apple, Resideo Technologies, Logitech, Dell, and HP as facing heightened risk from those tariffs.
Wow, that's a who's who of the tech world.
It is. Now, within that broader tech hardware space, there's also the segment of telecom and networking equipment.
Okay, what's happening in that corner of the tech world?
Morgan Stanley's telecom and networking equipment analyst, Meta Marshall, has some interesting insights. She believes that companies focused on core networking and industrial tech are more exposed to potential tariffs compared to those in the optical segment.
Why the difference? What makes one group more vulnerable than the other?
It comes down to where they're producing their goods. Optical companies tend to rely more on Southeast Asia for manufacturing, while core networking and industrial tech firms are more reliant on China.
Ah, so it's that China exposure again. The closer you are to the source of potential tariffs, the more risk you face.
Exactly. Now, Marshall does acknowledge that companies in her space have been actively trying to diversify their manufacturing. She expects those with a more global footprint to be better insulated from the impact of those tariffs.
That makes sense. The more spread out your production is, the less reliant you are on any one location and the less vulnerable you are to disruptions in any one place.
Right. But Marshall also points out there's still some caveats, even for companies with diversified manufacturing.
What kind of caveats?
Well, even if you're manufacturing in multiple countries, you might still need certain key components that are primarily sourced from China.
So even if you've diversified your production, you could still be vulnerable if those key components are coming from a place facing tariffs.
Exactly. It's like a chain. Even if most of the links are strong, if one crucial link is weak, the whole chain could break.
So diversification helps, but it doesn't completely eliminate the risk. It's all about managing those vulnerabilities and having backup plans.
You got it. It's a complex equation with lots of variables. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground on North America.
Mm,
Ready to hop across the Pacific and talk about Asia.
let's do it. What's the situation looking like over there?
Asia's fascinating because it's both at the heart of the supply chain shifts we're seeing and a potential beneficiary of the solutions.
Okay, that sounds like a bit of a paradox. How can it be both?
Well, as we've discussed, China's dominance in manufacturing is a major driver of all this reshuffling happening in global supply chains.
Right. Companies are trying to reduce their reliance on China, which is creating both disruptions and opportunities for others.
Exactly. But at the same time, other Asian countries are benefiting from these shifts as companies look for alternative manufacturing locations.
So it's like a game of musical chairs. Some are losing their seats while others are grabbing new ones.
Perfect analogy.
Oh,
And Morgan Stanley highlights this dynamic in their analysis of the Asia-Pacific region.
what's their take on the situation? Are Asian markets just rolling with the punches?
They've been adapting to these multipolar trends since 2018, but it hasn't gotten any easier. In fact, things have gotten even more complex. Product complexity and concentration have actually increased over time.
So it's a more challenging environment now than it was a few years ago.
Yes, and that's largely because of the rapid pace of technological advancements, especially in East Asia. Think about the concentration of leading-edge semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan, the explosion of the EV and battery industry in China, and the ongoing reliance on Japanese precision instruments.
So you have these pockets of highly specialized manufacturing that are really hard to replicate elsewhere. It's not just about having factories, it's about having the specific expertise and infrastructure.
Exactly. And then you've got the competition between the U.S.-led friendshoring initiatives and China's own supply-centric growth strategy. It's adding another layer of complexity.
Hold on, friendshoring, is that like nearshoring but with friends?
It's similar, but it goes beyond just geography. It's about building supply chains with countries that share similar values and geopolitical interests.
So it's about aligning with allies and building trust.
Exactly. And this is creating a bit of a tug of war between the U.S. and China, with each side trying to pull companies into their sphere of influence.
And caught in the middle of this tug of war are Asian companies trying to figure out how to navigate this increasingly complex landscape.
Exactly. And Morgan Stanley notes that all this competition is putting pressure on profit margins in key industries like autos, industrials, and chemicals.
So it's a tough environment for a lot of Asian companies. But amidst all the challenges, are there any silver linings, any opportunities emerging?
Absolutely. Some Asian companies are adapting to those increased trade barriers by investing in overseas production facilities and forming joint ventures with companies in other regions.
So they're diversifying, spreading their wings, and building relationships outside of their traditional markets.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to specific regions within Asia, Morgan Stanley has some key observations. They see China, Taiwan, and South Korea as potentially being hit the hardest by these supply chain strains.
Why those three? What makes them more vulnerable?
They're all heavily reliant on exports, especially to the U.S. and Europe, and they're facing rising competition from other Asian countries, as well as those reshoring efforts in developed markets.
So they're getting squeezed from multiple directions.
They are. But even within this group, there are nuances. For example, while Japan is also exposed to supply chain risks, it's seen as being better hedged because its production base is already more diversified, and there's a trend of reshoring happening within Japan itself.
So Japan is in a slightly stronger position. What about other parts of Asia?
Morgan Stanley sees potential benefits for India and the ASEAN countries as companies look for alternative manufacturing destinations.
Interesting. So it's a mixed bag in Asia, with some countries facing headwinds while others are catching a tailwind.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering that even within a single country, the impact will vary depending on the specific industry and company.
So there are winners and losers everywhere you look. This really highlights the complexity of this whole situation.
It does. Now, shifting gears from regional dynamics, are there any specific sectors in Asia that Morgan Stanley highlights?
I'm all ears. Which industries are standing out?
They've identified a group of companies they call supply chain diversification beneficiaries. These are the companies poised to benefit from the ongoing reshuffling of supply chains, and they're actually outperforming the broader market.
So they're the ones grabbing those musical chairs as the music stops. They're the winners in this game.
Exactly. And Morgan Stanley is also bullish on aerospace and defense, certain capital good companies that are enabling localization and friendshoring, critical minerals, and companies focused on China localization.
Wait, China localization? What's that all about? Aren't companies trying to move away from China?
They are, but there's still a huge market in China. These companies are helping multinational corporations set up shop and operate within the Chinese market, even as those same companies might be diversifying their production elsewhere.
So it's about managing that delicate balance between diversifying globally and still tapping into the Chinese market. It's all about strategy. But are there any sectors of Asia that are struggling?
There are. Morgan Stanley sees auto parts, tech hardware, and semiconductors as facing potential margin compression because of these supply chain strains.
Makes sense. Those industries are heavily reliant on global supply chains and are facing both rising costs and increased competition. It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. They're caught in the crosshairs of these supply chain wars.
Okay, we've covered North America and Asia. Time to hop across the pond and talk about Europe. What's the story there?
Europe presents a unique and complex set of challenges and opportunities in this age of the multipolar world and supply chain strain.
Why is Europe so unique in this context? What makes them stand out?
Well, for starters, it's the most geographically diverse equity market in the world. European companies earn a big chunk of their revenues from outside of Europe, with the U.S. being a particularly important market.
So they're heavily exposed to global trade flows, which makes them vulnerable to disruptions, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this makes them vulnerable to any hiccups in those flows, whether it's trade tensions, geopolitical events, or even just those rising costs of transportation and logistics.
So European companies are walking a tightrope. They need to stay connected to global markets for their business to thrive, but that connection also makes them vulnerable.
That's a great way to put it. And Morgan Stanley's research really highlights this delicate balance. They estimate that only about 29% of the MSCI Europe's free float market cap weighted revenues are actually generated within continental Europe.
So the vast majority of their business comes from somewhere else.
Exactly. Another 9% comes from the UK, which means a whopping 62% of revenues are coming from outside of Europe.
That's a huge exposure to global markets.
It is. And their data shows that this exposure has actually been increasing over time. European companies have become more globalized, which has brought benefits, but also made them more sensitive to those external shocks.
So they're reaping the rewards of globalization, but also facing the risks that come with it. It's a trade-off. But how is all the supply chain strain actually playing out in Europe?
Morgan Stanley finds that the situation in Europe is more idiosyncratic than broad-based.
Meaning?
The impact varies greatly depending on the specific company, industry, and their exposure to different regions and supply chains. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
So some companies are weathering the storm better than others. Some are even finding ways to thrive in this environment.
Exactly. Now let's zoom in on Europe's potential exposure to those tariffs, especially those related to the U.S.
Okay, tariffs are a big concern, especially with all the talk about trade wars and protectionism.
Yeah.
How vulnerable are European companies?
Well, the overall U.S. revenue exposure for MSCI Europe is around 26%, but here's the interesting part. Most of that exposure is actually to what they call local-to-local goods and services.
Local to local, what does that even mean?
It refers to goods and services that are produced and consumed within the same region, in this case, the U.S.
So a European company might have a factory in the U.S. that's making products specifically for U.S. customers.
Exactly. And that kind of business is less vulnerable to tariffs on goods imported from outside the U.S.
Makes sense. So how much of that 26% U.S. revenue exposure is actually at risk from tariffs?
Morgan Stanley estimates that only about 9.9% of MSCI Europe's U.S. revenue exposure is related to goods that are actually exported to the U.S. from outside the country.
So less than half of their total U.S. exposure. That's not as bad as I thought it might be.
Right. And even within that 9.9%, there are some companies that are considered relatively protected from those tariffs.
What makes them protected? Some kind of special status?
They tend to be in industries where companies have high pricing power. That means they have more flexibility to pass on those increased costs to their customers without losing market share.
Ah, so they can absorb some of that tariff shock without hurting their bottom line too much.
Exactly. And these relatively protected stocks make up about 3% of MSCI Europe's weighted revenues.
So all things considered, it sounds like European companies are facing a manageable level of tariff risk, at least when it comes to the U.S. market.
That's a fair assessment. But remember, this is just a snapshot of the current situation. Things can change quickly in this global trade environment.
You're right. New tariffs could pop up, existing ones could get hiked up, and trade tensions could escalate.
Exactly. European companies can't afford to be complacent, even if the current risk level seems manageable. They need to stay agile and adapt to whatever comes their way.
Speaking of adapting, what about nearshoring in Europe? Is that a big trend over there like it is in North America?
It is. Nearshoring is definitely on the radar for a lot of European companies.
And what's driving that trend? Are the motivations similar to what we're seeing in North America?
They are. It's that same combination of wanting to reduce reliance on China, improve supply chain resilience, and respond to those geopolitical uncertainties. It's about taking control and reducing risk.
So it's a strategic move. Are companies just talking about nearshoring, or are they actually doing it?
They're walking the walk. Morgan Stanley has been tracking mentions of nearshoring in European corporate transcripts, and they've noticed a significant uptick in recent months.
So it's more than just talk. Companies are actually taking action. What kind of actions are we talking about? Any specific examples?
Absolutely. For example, some European automakers are moving production of certain models from China back to Europe.
So bringing manufacturing closer to their home market makes sense.
Yes. And we're also seeing companies relocating production from Asia to Eastern European countries.
Why Eastern Europe? What makes that region so attractive?
It's a combination of factors. They offer lower labor costs than Western Europe. They're geographically closer to those major Western European markets, and they have a growing base of skilled workers.
So it's kind of a sweet spot for some companies, a good balance of cost effectiveness and proximity to their target markets.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that nearshoring in Europe faces some unique challenges as well.
Okay, what are we talking about here? What are the hurdles?
Well, Europe is a highly regulated environment, which can make setting up new manufacturing operations more complex and costly.
Ah, so there's more red tape to cut through. That could definitely slow things down.
It can. And then there's the issue of infrastructure. While some parts of Europe have excellent infrastructure, others are lagging behind, which can discourage investment.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Nearshoring might be a good fit for some regions and industries in Europe, but not for others.
Exactly. It all comes down to careful planning and choosing the right location for your specific needs. Now, speaking of nearshoring in Europe, Morgan Stanley highlights a case study that perfectly illustrates these dynamics. Electrical transformers.
Oh, transformers again. We talked about those in the European context earlier.
We did, but this time the focus is on how European companies in the electric transformer industry have been responding to competition from Asia, especially China.
So it's a similar story to the one we discussed before, but with a European twist?
Exactly. European transformer manufacturers have faced a tough choice. Compete on cost with those Asian rivals, or focus on higher value products and markets.
So go for volume or go for quality? What path did they choose?
A lot of them have opted for quality. They're focusing on developing advanced transformers that meet the specific needs of European power grids.
So they're moving up the value chain, focusing on innovation and specialized products.
Exactly. And this has helped them to hold on to their market share, even as Asian companies have become more competitive on price.
It's like they're saying, we can't beat you on price, but we can beat you on quality and innovation.
That's a great way to put it. Now, nearshoring has also played a role in this story.
Okay, how so?
Some European transformer companies have set up production facilities in Eastern Europe, closer to their key markets.
So they're getting closer to their customers and reducing their reliance on those longer Asian supply chains.
Exactly. And this move is partly driven by a desire to reduce transportation costs and lead times, but it's also about making their supply chains more resilient.
So they're killing two birds with one stone, cutting costs and reducing risk. This transformer case study is a great example of how European companies are adapting to this new world.
It is. And it highlights some key lessons about nearshoring in Europe.
All right, I'm ready for the lessons learned. Hit me with them.
First, it's not just about chasing cheap labor. It's about finding that sweet spot between cost competitiveness and other important factors, like access to skilled workers, reliable infrastructure, and a stable political environment.
So it's a more nuanced decision than just picking the cheapest location. You have to consider the bigger picture.
Exactly. Second, nearshoring requires a long-term commitment. It takes time to build up the necessary infrastructure and cultivate those strong supplier relationships.
It's not a quick fix. It's about making a strategic investment in the future.
Exactly. And third, nearshoring doesn't necessarily mean completely severing ties with Asia. Many European companies will continue to have operations in Asia, even as they shift some production closer to home.
So it's about diversification, not complete decoupling. It's about having a balanced portfolio of manufacturing locations.
Precisely. Now let's zoom out from specific industries and look at the bigger macroeconomic picture.
Okay, so we've talked about how companies are adapting, but what about the bigger picture? What are the macroeconomic trends and concerns in Europe right now?
Morgan Stanley points to a few key issues. First, that economic slowdown in China has actually had a noticeable impact on European corporate earnings.
So what happens in China doesn't stay in China. It's a ripple effect across the globe.
Exactly. And it's partly because China is a huge export market for European companies, but it's also because many European companies have manufacturing operations in China. So they're feeling the pinch on both ends. Less demand for their products and disruptions to their production.
It's a double whammy. It really highlights how interconnected the global economy is. What else are European companies worried about?
Well, another big concern is the ongoing energy crisis. With the war in Ukraine and the disruptions to energy supplies from Russia, energy prices have skyrocketed.
Yeah, that's been all over the news. How is that impacting businesses?
It's hitting energy-intensive industries especially hard, but even companies that don't use a ton of energy directly are feeling the effects. Their input costs are going up, and consumers are tightening their belts, so there's less spending overall.
It's a chain reaction. One disruption can trigger a whole cascade of effects throughout the economy.
Exactly. And this energy crisis is adding another layer of complexity to those supply chain challenges European companies are already facing. It's like trying to juggle while riding a unicycle on a tightrope.
Okay, that's a pretty vivid image. But amidst all these challenges, surely there must be some silver linings. What's the good news?
There is some good news.
Yeah.
Morgan Stanley believes that this whole nearshoring trend could actually create new opportunities for European companies.
Okay, I'm listening. How could nearshoring be a positive thing?
Well, as companies move production from Asia to Europe, it could boost demand for goods and services from European suppliers. It's like a local economic boost.
So it could create a ripple effect, but in a good way this time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it could also lead to job creation and economic growth in regions that are struggling with high unemployment.
So nearshoring could be a win-win for some European economies. That's encouraging. What else are European companies doing to adapt and thrive in this environment?
Another potential bright spot is all the investment happening in renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Right, the green transition, everyone's talking about that.
Exactly. This investment is being driven by a few things. There's the desire to become less reliant on Russian energy, of course, but there's also the push to meet climate goals and create new economic opportunities.
So it's a multi-pronged strategy, and it's good news for companies involved in the renewable energy sector.
Absolutely. And it's also creating opportunities for companies in related industries like construction, manufacturing, and engineering.
So it's not just about wind turbines and solar panels. It's about a whole ecosystem of industries that are being energized by this transition. It sounds like Europe is facing some serious challenges, but they're also actively finding solutions and creating new opportunities.
Exactly. It's not all doom and gloom. It's about adapting and finding ways to thrive in this new reality.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about regions and sectors, but Morgan Stanley has this interesting framework for thinking about individual companies and how they're being impacted by all of this. Remind me what it was again.
They call them enablers and defenders.
Right. The companies that are riding the wave of change and those that are weathering the storm. Let's dive back into that.
The enablers are those companies that are actually benefiting from all the disruption and shifts happening in global supply chains. They're providing the solutions that companies need to adapt and thrive.
Can you give me some examples of these enablers in action?
Absolutely. Logistics companies are a prime example. As supply chains become more complex and fragmented, companies need more help moving goods around the world. Logistics providers step in to meet that need.
It's like they're the traffic controllers of the global economy, making sure everything flows smoothly, even amidst all the chaos. What about other types of enablers?
Then you have those companies that specialize in helping other companies set up their manufacturing in new places. They're the nearshoring and reshoring experts.
So they're like the architects of this new supply chain landscape, helping companies build their operations in the right locations.
Exactly. And we can't forget about those tech companies that are creating software and services to help companies optimize their supply chains.
So they're bringing the digital tools to the table, helping companies become more efficient, agile, and responsive in this fast-changing world.
Precisely. Now, on the other side of the spectrum are those defenders.
Okay, remind me again, what makes a defender stand out? What are their superpowers?
Defenders are the companies that are relatively shielded from the negative impacts of all this supply chain strain. There are a few key characteristics that help them weather the storm.
Oh, okay, so what makes them so resilient?
First, they often have strong regional supply chains. This means they're not as reliant on those global trade flows and are less vulnerable to disruptions.
So they've got a solid foundation close to home, They're not as exposed to those global risks.
Exactly. Second, defenders tend to produce goods that aren't as affected by those global supply chain shifts. These might be essential goods or products that are difficult to transport over long distances.
So they're meeting a constant need, regardless of what's happening in global trade. They're the reliable providers of everyday essentials.
Exactly. It's like they've built a fortress around their business, protecting them from those external shocks.
Okay, I love that imagery. So you've got those nimble enablers riding the waves of change, and those sturdy defenders holding strong amidst the turbulence. It's a fascinating dynamic, but can you give me some real-world examples of these enablers and defenders in action?
Of course. One enabler that Morgan Stanley highlights is Samsung E&A Co. Ltd., a South Korean company involved in construction and engineering. They're benefiting from the increased demand for infrastructure projects related to all this supply chain diversification we've been talking about.
So as companies scramble to build new factories and warehouses in new locations, Samsung E&A is there to help make it happen.
Exactly. They're providing the bricks and mortar for this new supply chain world.
Okay, what about a defender example? Who's holding strong?
Morgan Stanley points to Wilscott Holdings Corp., a U.S.-based company that provides modular space and portable storage solutions.
Okay, that's interesting. What makes them a defender in this environment?
Well, their business is largely regional, so they're not as exposed to global trade flows. Plus, their products are essential for a variety of industries. They're meeting a consistent need regardless of what's happening in global trade.
Ah, so they're providing those essential building blocks no matter what's going on in the world. They're the reliable backbone of the economy.
It's pretty cool to see how different companies are finding their own ways to adapt and thrive.
It is. And these are just two examples. There are many other companies that could be classified as enablers or defenders, depending on their specific circumstances. It's a fluid landscape with companies constantly evolving and adjusting their strategies. Okay, so we've talked about companies and regions, sectors and strategies, but what about the investors? Where are they putting their money in this age of supply chain strain? What are the hot investment themes?
Morgan Stanley has identified a few key themes that are attracting a lot of investor interest.
Okay, spill the beans. What are the smart investors betting on?
One big one is automation.
Makes sense. If you can automate tasks, you can reduce your reliance on labor, which is huge in an environment where labor costs are rising and skilled workers are in short supply.
Exactly. And automation can also help boost efficiency and speed up production. That's crucial in a world where supply chains are facing constant pressure.
So robots to the rescue.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
They're becoming more and more important for companies that want to stay competitive and resilient.
Okay, what else are investors excited about?
Well, reshoring and nearshoring are also hot themes, as we've been discussing throughout this entire deep dive.
Right, so investors are betting on those companies that are helping to bring manufacturing back closer to home, either to the U.S. or to nearby regions.
Exactly. They're looking at companies that are facilitating that shift, like logistics providers, construction companies, and engineering firms. They're also looking at the manufacturers themselves, of course.
So it's not just about the factories, it's about the entire ecosystem that supports them.
Precisely. Now, another area that's attracting a lot of attention is critical minerals.
Critical minerals. Refresh my memory. What are those again?
These are minerals that are essential for all those modern technologies we rely on. Batteries for electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, you name it.
Ah, so they're the building blocks of the green transition.
Exactly. And as demand for these green technologies explodes, so does the demand for those critical minerals.
Makes sense. It's a classic supply and demand story, but what makes them so critical?
The supply of these minerals is often concentrated in just a few countries, which creates all sorts of geopolitical risks and supply chain vulnerabilities.
So it's not just about finding the minerals, it's about securing access to them in a way that's reliable and sustainable.
Exactly. And that's why investors are looking for companies involved in mining, processing, and recycling these critical minerals.
They're trying to get ahead of the curve and position themselves for the huge growth that's expected in this sector. It's like the gold rush of the 21st century.
That's a great way to put it. Now, one more investment theme that Morgan Stanley highlights is cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity. Okay, that's interesting. How does that relate to all this supply chain stuff?
Well, as supply chains become more digital and interconnected, they also become more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Think about it. A cyber attack on a key supplier or a logistics provider could disrupt an entire supply chain It's a domino effect.
That's kind of scary. It's like a whole new battlefield in this global economic war.
It is. And that's why investors are pouring money into companies that provide cybersecurity solutions specifically designed for supply chains.
So they're the digital guardians, protecting those critical networks and data flows.
Exactly. They are in high demand as companies realize that cybersecurity is no longer just an IT issue. It's a business imperative, especially in this interconnected world.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today. It's been a whirlwind tour of the global supply chain landscape. But what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing they should remember from this deep dive?
Morgan Stanley's research makes it crystal clear. Supply chain strain is not going away. It's a defining feature of this new multipolar world. It's the new normal, and it's here to stay.
So we better get used to it.
We do. But it's not all bad news. There are opportunities out there for those who are prepared to adapt and innovate.
So what's the key message for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they go about their day, make decisions, maybe even invest their money?
Understanding supply chain strain is crucial for navigating the future. It doesn't matter if you're a business leader, an investor, or just someone trying to understand the world around them. This stuff affects all of us.
So it's not just about economics, it's about everything.
Exactly. The decisions that companies and governments make about supply chains will have a ripple effect across our lives, from the products we buy to the jobs we have, and even to the overall stability of the global economy.
It's all connected.
It is. So stay informed, stay curious, and most importantly, stay adaptable.
Words to live by in this ever-changing world. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into global supply chains. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world.